Hello, this is Paul Wasak from Part Supercenter. I will be your presenter for today's webinar on the top 10 recommended service advisories for Magneblast switchgear and circuit breakers. With me today is Rachel Pope, our moderator. She will be assisting me with questions later in the webinar. Some housekeeping before we start. We will be recording today's webinar and it will be available at a later date on our website. A link will be emailed to each attendee as well as today's slides. We'll set aside some time at the end of the presentation for Q&A. You can send in your questions using the Q&A button on the right side of your screen. Please include your email address so we know who to respond to if we don't get through all the questions or if we need further research to answer them. My presentation will go for about 30 minutes today, followed by 15 minutes for questions and answers. In between, we'll talk about what a service advisory is and go through the top 10 most popular service advisories. I'll start with an introduction of Part Supercenter and then myself. Part Supercenter is an OEM parts business supporting 4 product segments, as represented by the icons on the screen from left to right: transformers, then circuit breakers and switchgear, followed by drives and controls, and finally motors all the way on the right. Many, but not all of these products that we support have roots that can be traced back to General Electric, as we were once part of GE. We specialize in genuine OEM parts. A little bit about myself. Again, my name is Paul Wasak. I am the product manager responsible for General Electric Magneblast switchgear and circuit breakers. I have more than 30 years of related industry experience with circuit breakers and switchgear, and I'm pleased to spend some time this afternoon with you to discuss Magneblast service advisories. Part Supercenter has been the licensed OEM for the Magneblast product line since the GE factory that was located in Philadelphia closed in 2002. Part Supercenter, or PSC for short, has care and custody of all the intellectual property related to the design and manufacture of the GE Magneblast product line. PSC is exclusively responsible for the manufacture and sale of all OEM replacement parts, as well as the engineering support and equipment modifications for the Magneblast line. Let's get into service advisories. A service advisory letter is a formal written notification from GE to a customer to share information about the product that has changed since it was delivered and manufactured years ago. While it's not exactly the same, you can think of it as being similar to a recall notice for your car. It will include a service advisory number, a short summary, background information about the issue and how it relates to operating the equipment, and then a recommendation as to the criticality of the information being shared. In the case of the service advisory on the screen, it's sharing information about a weld that may be suspect that attaches a pin to a trip crank on an operating mechanism. While there are hundreds of service advisory letters, SALs for short, not all apply to every model and rating of Magneblast switchgear and circuit breakers. There's one granddaddy of all the service advisory letters. It's SAL 352.1. It's a summary of the most important service advisory letters related to Magneblast breakers and switchgear. It's presented in a table format that includes effective dates as well as model information for the that is applicable to the specific switchgear and breaker. It also includes ordering information when parts will be necessary. Rating that ranges from 1 to 3. 1 being strongly recommended, 2 is incorporate during the next overhaul, and 3 is recommended only if you're experiencing problems. Let's get into the top 10 service advisories. Along with the slides that will be emailed after this presentation, we'll also include a copy of Service Advisory Letter 352.1. First is SAL 364.1. This is for shock absorbing stop studs and stop bolts used in the cubicle in conjunction with the elevating mechanism. The purpose of the existing stop studs and bolts are to protect against over travel if the upper mercury limit switch either fails or is out of adjustment. The stops prevent damage to the primary disconnects and elevating mechanisms by mechanically impeding any further travel of the breaker in the upward direction once the breaker lifting rails hit the front stop stud or the elevating mechanism lifting box hits the rear stop bolt. These are meant to be emergency stopping devices and are not designed to be touched or kissed at the end of the breaker elevating operation. The design intent is for the mercury switches to stop the breaker travel when in the fully raised position. The shock absorbing stop studs and bolts were designed after recognizing that either on purpose or through misadjustment of the upper limit switch, the stop studs were being used to stop the breaker when it is being elevated into the connected position. Again, this can create excessive wear on the clutch assembly, the elevating gears, and the motor when the unit elevating system comes to an abrupt stop. After input from customers in the nuclear industry, GE designed and tested shock absorber type studs and bolts to replace the existing ones to help alleviate this condition. Ordering information with kit part numbers can be found in the SAL that will be emailed with these slides. The next recommendation is number 30 on SAL 352.1. This relates to the black pitch potting material in the tops of the primary disconnects. Primary disconnects are located in the switchgear. They are the interface point where the circuit breaker electrical bushings plug into the switchgear. You may hear them referred to by their slang names, bottles or jugs. The black pitch material was replaced with a modern solid dielectric epoxy starting in 1994 due to oil migration out of the black pitch and dripping down onto the circuit breaker bushings. The picture on the left is representative of this condition and is a view looking up into the bottom of the primary disconnect where the bushing on the circuit breaker would plug in. Operating experience has shown the oil tends to migrate out of the pitch more frequently on circuit breakers that operate near their continuous current nameplate rating, that operate in high ambient temperatures, and after 40 years or more of service. Up until 5 years ago, the recommendation was to clean the oil residue off the primary disconnect and circuit breaker bushings and then return it to service. However, operating experience has shown that this oil may collect contamination such as dust from the environment and begin to track, which could potentially cause a dielectric failure. Therefore, the recommendation has been revised to replace these units as soon as possible if oil is found to be leaking from the pitch. Next is SAL 354.1. This is for changes to the recommended greases for the Magneblast breaker and switchgear. A superior red synthetic hydrocarbon grease now replaces the white or amber mechanical grease and the black contact grease for periodic maintenance and general overhaul. This new recommended grease was successfully design tested and qualified during continuous current tests, 10,000 operation design life tests, as well as short circuit power testing. The change to this grease is effective 1990. The service advisory letter also includes a table with references to all of the lubricants and lubrication requirements for Magneblast breakers and switchgear. A copy of this service advisory letter with ordering information will be included with these slides from today's webinar. Lubrication failures are one of the most common problems reported with operating mechanisms. This service advisory helps eliminate many of those lubrication problems with this modern synthetic grease. Next is SAL 351.1, which adds a second prop retrieving spring to return and reset the prop on the ML13 mechanism during a breaker closing operation. Operating experience in the late 90s showed random failures to latch. After investigation, it was determined that inconsistent prop action was the root cause. The addition of a second prop spring allowed for consistent and earliest reset of the prop under the prop pin with minimal rebound and over travel. There have been several other changes made to the prop springs and prop spring bracket that are reflected in the latest version shown here, in which the prop spring bracket is blue in color. This is a relatively recent change that eliminated the shoulder bolts that hold the bracket to the prop. This advisory is effective 1994 and is highly recommended for all ratings of Magneblast circuit breakers with ML13 mechanisms. Next is number 2 on SAL 352.1, which adds a shock mount for the 52Y anti-pump relay to prevent trip-free operations during closings that are caused by vibration. This change to the shock mounting became effective in 1971. The advisory is recommended to be added during the next circuit breaker overhaul. Again, ordering information will be included in the service advisory accompanying these slides. You can see on the right side the dampeners that join the 52Y support bracket to the mounting bracket above. Next is number 4, also on Service Advisory 352.1, which revised the driving pawl pivot pin assembly to improve reliability. The previous design had a pin welded to the backer plate. Operating experience over the years showed that the weld on this pin was not as reliable as intended. The revised design eliminates this failure mode. This change was introduced into production on circuit breakers manufactured in 1979 and later. This advisory is recommended to be added during the next breaker overhaul. The modification involves removing the old crank assembly and replacing it with the crank assembly shown on the right side of this slide, which includes a new driving pawl and bias spring. Ordering information, again, will be included in the service advisory that accompanies these slides. Next up is number 3 on SAL 352.1, which standardized on the superior bronze square shaft bushings and eliminated the cast iron bushings that were used on certain ML13 breaker mechanisms. This change was introduced into production on breakers manufactured 1985 and later. This advisory is recommended to be added during the next breaker overhaul. The modification involves removing the 2 cast iron bushings from the 2-inch square shaft and replacing with 2 bronze bushings as shown on the right side of this slide and in the center. Cracked cast iron bushings have been attributed to slow and sluggish breaker operation in a number of instances. Ordering information, again, will be included in the service advisory that accompanies these slides. Next is number 1, also on SAL 352, which replaces the Tough Lock mechanical bushings with superior bronze bushings. Tough Lock is a Teflon impregnated fiberglass that was white in color. It was intended to be a maintenance-free mechanical bushing. Although they passed the original design life testing, operational experience proved that environmental contamination caused wear and poor performance. This change was introduced into production on breakers manufactured 1974 and later for all Tough Lock bushings with the exceptions of those in the prop. The prop is the middle photograph on the top of the slide. This advisory is recommended to be added during the next breaker overhaul since it's a significant amount of work to change these out. The modification involves removing the Tough Lock bushings from most of the links, latches, and pawls and pressing in new bronze bushings. Tough Lock bushings have been attributed to many issues with the operating mechanism, including slow and sluggish operation, failure to latch, and failure to charge the closing springs. Again, ordering information will be included with the service advisory accompanying these slides. Next is number 5 on SAL 352.1, which changed the latching pawl stop block for improved wear characteristics and reliability. The stop block mounting holes were changed to slots to facilitate clearance adjustments between the ratchet wheel and the latching pawls. It also increased the width of the stop block so that both the latching and holding pawls would strike it. This change was introduced into production on breakers manufactured in 1984 and later. Once again, ordering information will be included in the service advisory accompanying these slides. Last but not least is number 3 on SAL 352.1, which replaced the latching pawl pivot pin with a redesigned captive hinge pin for increased reliability and ease of maintenance. Although they passed the original design life testing, once again, operational experience indicated the original design was not as reliable as desired. This change was introduced into production on breakers manufactured in 1979 and later. This advisory is recommended to be added if the latching pawls are being replaced. Ordering information, again, will be included in the service advisory accompanying these slides. That concludes the information related to the service. We'd like to invite you to join our weekly newsletter related to everything Magneblast. There will be a link to sign up for the Magneblast Minute included with the email with the slides from this webinar. Please let us know if you liked today's webinar and found it informative. Our next scheduled webinar will be on troubleshooting control valves on GE oil circuit breaker mechanisms on May 13th, once again at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time. We will include the sign-up link shown on this slide with the emailed files from this webinar. Hope to see you there on May 13th. Now I'd like to open it up for questions. Rachel, do we have some questions?
Right now, we do not have any questions. So if anybody does have any questions, feel free to post them in the live Q&A on the right-hand side of the webinar. I went ahead and posted the link to sign up for our upcoming webinar in the Q&A. If anybody has any questions, please put your questions there. Otherwise, you can send us an email at sales@partssupercenter or pscparts.com. Okay, we have a question. The question is, where are the SELs located, or must they be sent?
That's a good question. The SAL letters were originally mailed, usually via certified mail, to the customers who had equipment that was affected by the service advisory letters. They would have been emailed by GE at the time they were issued. We have a repository on file of all the service advisory letters. So if someone has a list of their circuit breakers or switchgear that they want us to query against the active service advisory letters, we can do that and let them know which ones apply to their circuit breakers that they still have in service or switchgear.
Perfect. Thank you, Paul. And we have another question. How do we get the presentation? And the presentation will be sent to everybody who's attended today's webinar, as well as on our website. So either way, you can do that. And we also have a YouTube channel if you want to go ahead and follow us on YouTube, and we'll be posting all of the recorded webinars there as well. Okay, we have another question. What are your thoughts on repotting the primary disconnects as opposed to ordering new?
We don't recommend repotting the primary disconnects. By repotting, I believe you mean digging out the black pitch and putting in a new solid dielectric epoxy. The reason we don't recommend that is we've had some experience with doing that, and if the new solid dielectric that's being put into the primary disconnect hasn't been tested, it's possible that it can have a different thermal coefficient of expansion, and when the primary disconnect heats up, it's possible to break the porcelain bottle that's cemented to the metal base and has the copper contact and connection bar attached to it. So the reason we know that is because during design testing, we had that actually happen. So there were several iterations of the design before we found a mixture of epoxies that worked correctly. So all of the service advisories that we've talked about, including the primary disconnects, have been completely design tested by General Electric at high power labs when necessary, and they all meet the requirements of IEEE C37.59, which talks about modifications and substitutions of major components and parts within the switchgear and circuit breakers. So for those reasons, we do not recommend repotting them. What we would recommend if a customer has a large number of primary disconnects in service would be to create a program to change them out and have them remanufactured. When we remanufacture them, we break the porcelains out of the metal bases. We test the metal bases to make sure there's no cracks. We then cement in new porcelains. And the reason we put new porcelains in is because there is no easy way to test the porcelains for cracks. It's very difficult to hydrostatically test those porcelains without taking them out of the metal base and without removing the babbited in copper contact. So that's the reason why we replace the porcelains. And then once we cement new porcelains into the metal base, we will go ahead and take the copper with its brazed on connector bar. We'll go ahead and replate both ends of that assembly. We will re-insulate it. We will babbit that back into the porcelain tube, and then we will go ahead and re-insulate with a solid dielectric material instead of the existing black pitch. When we do that, we use the same master fixtures that were in the factory when these units were originally built, therefore ensuring that they will absolutely positively fit back into the cubicle and accept the circuit breaker in the manner it was intended to fit.
Perfect. Thank you, Paul. We've got quite a few additional questions come in. Are there service advisory letters for other types of GE switchgear, for example, power vac?
Yes, there are service advisory letters for all of the GE circuit breakers, including the outdoor oil circuit breakers, the low voltage AK, AKR, and Wave Pro, and the medium voltage Magneblast and Power Vac. We have access to the majority of those. So again, if a customer has an installed base list with serial numbers of their circuit breakers, we can take that list and go through and cross-reference the serial number of the installed breaker to the list of service advisories and see which ones apply, and then share those with the customer. So go ahead and email those to myself or the sales team. Both email addresses are on the screen now and will also be included with the slides from this webinar. Next question.
Perfect. Thank you, Paul. One question was, can you get all the SAL's sheets from ML13 Mech? We repair for many customers.
Yes, we can provide that. We will provide that with the slides from today's webinar. It will be the service advisory that I described as the granddaddy of all service advisories. It's in a tabular format, and it describes the effective dates for each service advisory, as well as the ordering information and what ratings, if any, that it applies to if it does not apply to all of the ratings. Next question.
Okay, next question is, are you stocking the control switch kits for SAL 361.1?
Okay, one of the service advisories we did not talk about is the control switches. The control switch SAL is not necessarily one of the most popular ones. However, there are a lot of customers who have installed it. It replaces the micro switches that GE provided for the 52 IS switch, the 52 SM LS switch, and the 52 CL-MS switch. Those little push button micro switches were manufactured by GE, and over the years they were determined to be less reliable than desired, and the nuclear industry asked General Electric to come up with a more robust replacement, and that was done back in the mid-2000s and introduced to the market. They are slightly more expensive, or considerably more expensive, than the original switches. They have been adopted by the nuclear industry and a lot of the generating locations since the 52 SML LS switch and the CLMS switch will cause the breaker to not be able to close, which is a critical function in power plants. So a lot of the power plants have adopted those. We do stock those switches. We have 4 different kits depending on the actual configuration of a customer's mechanism and circuit breaker. So if we have the customer's circuit breaker serial number, we can go ahead and look up and see what configuration was shipped to each customer and then provide the correct part number for the switch kit needed. Hopefully I answered that question. Next question.
Perfect. Thanks, Paul. The next question is, you said some of the service advisory letter recommendations should be completed when the breaker is overhauled. Is there a recommended frequency for the overhaul?
Yes, there is a service advisory that talks about the recommended service overhaul intervals, and that is the service advisory that is for the greases. So we will include that with the slides from today's webinar. It talks about the service conditions as well as the recommended maintenance intervals based upon the instruction books for the particular breakers. So some of the instruction books, depending on the breaker model, will have a different recommendation for the circuit breaker. We'll make sure that we include that with the slides from today's webinar. Next question.
The next question is, does PSC offer switchgear retrofitting to include all the SALs?
So there's 2 parts to that question. The first is the circuit breaker, and the second is the cubicle. So for the circuit breaker, through the network of the former GE shops, which are now ABB, we can provide upgrades to your circuit breakers to incorporate all the recommended service advisories. Or if you would prefer to put a roll-in retrofit breaker into the cubicle, we can provide a brand new vacuum retrofit breaker that will meet all the requirements of the original switchgear, and all the interface points will fit as originally designed. With respect to the cubicles, we can take the summary number of the switchgear and we can look to see, again, what service advisories apply to that particular switchgear. And in addition to bringing it up to the latest design standards, We can also modify that equipment or uprate that equipment if the customer so desires. Specific types of uprates would be if you were going to upgrade a circuit breaker from a nominal 250 MVA 5 kV breaker to a 350 MVA nominal 1200 amp 5 kV circuit breaker. So what we would do in that case is we would make sure that the switchgear would match the momentary and close and latch rating of the uprated 350 MVA nominal circuit breaker. That would typically involve bus bracing required to withstand the mechanical short circuit forces at 78 kA, as opposed to the 60 kA momentary forces for the nominal 250 MVA circuit breaker. We can also provide uprates to the switchgear if a customer wanted to change the continuous current rating as well. Again, if the customer wanted to retrofit in a 2000 amp breaker into a position that had a 1200 amp breaker, we can go ahead and convert that cubicle. We'll provide a kit of parts with every nut, bolt, piece of bus, insulation, and instructions to do the installation as well to convert that cubicle from 1200, let's say, to 2000 amps continuous. The type of modifications that would have to be done to the cubicle is the run back bus would most likely need to be changed to a 2000 amp run back bus. The shutter and primary disconnect would also most likely need to be changed. And then there are certain ferrous or steel panels within the switchgear that would need to be changed out to a non-magnetic material to prevent circulating currents as well. When those type of modifications are done, we also provide a new nameplate that establishes or reestablishes the new rating of the switchgear. Next question.
The next question is, where do I locate the parts, disk, and PNs for needed parts per the SALS? Sorry about that.
No problem. The part numbers that are related to the service advisories for the service advisories that require action other than an inspection are located with the service advisory. So they'll be ordering information. If in some cases additional information other than the part number is required, that will be included in the service advisory. For instance, if you wanted to change out your primary disconnects and you didn't have the part numbers are not listed in the service advisory because there are hundreds of different primary disconnects. In that case, we would ask for the summary number of the switchgear, and we'll include a document with these slides that we email out that will show you where to find that summary number. In addition, we will also need the cubicle number, and that's just a uniform reference from left to right of which compartment you're in, so we'll know which primary disconnect to identify. We'll make sure we identify the correct primary disconnect and get you that part number. So hopefully I answered that one as well. Next.
Thanks, Paul. The next question is, so SAL 364.1 stop studs, are these required if Merck SWs are functional?
So the question is, are the shock absorbing stop studs required if the mercury switches are operating correctly and properly adjusted? And the answer is that is up to the customer. Some customers perform much more rigorous maintenance and have a higher level of confidence in their ability to adjust the switches in the cubicle, the mercury switches. In cases where customers are not sure that they are doing it correctly or they insist on touching those studs, we would recommend the shock absorbing stop studs. They're also very popular in seismic rich environments. They were installed in all of the cubicles in Chile after the big earthquake about 5 or 6 years ago. That earthquake was above an 8, and they had a subsequent earthquake that was near but not exactly 8.0, and the cubicles survived much better than before they put the shock absorbing stop studs in. So the premise is that They elevated the breaker up and got a little bit of compression against the stop stud and allowed them to have a little bit more dampening than if the breaker was just on the lifting rails. So it all depends on how comfortable the customer is with their maintenance. Also, if they have remote racking, some of the remote racking units out there are not calibrated to each individual cubicle. So they will elevate the breaker into position based upon the number of turns the jack screw encounters, or torque sensing on the motor, or some other methods which may not necessarily stop the breaker at the same point depending on the weight and the size of the breaker. So in those cases, customers might also want to consider shock absorbing stop studs. We have experienced a bit of uptick in damage to elevating mechanisms since remote racking became popular a few years back. So based upon those considerations, customers will have to make a determination on whether they want these shock absorbing studs or not. Next question.
Perfect. Thanks, Paul. The next question is there a master list available that would show all service advisory recommended by breaker model number and or age?
There is not a single list that has all of the service advisories for all the breakers and all vintages and ages and ratings. However, that granddaddy of SALs that I mentioned earlier does have the majority of the modern service advisory letters listed on it, and the most important ones. We also have a somewhat complete summary list of additional service advisories for the cubicles and switchgear. We'll include that with the slides that we email out for this webinar. Although it's not 100% complete, it probably has greater than 80% of all the service advisories for Magneblast switchgear, and I think that customers will find it very helpful. Next question.
I believe this is our final question. Does PSC still offer the complete bushing package kit for the rebuild ML-13 mechanism?
Yes. The service advisory that talked about the Teflon replacements for the Teflon impregnated bushings, there is a part number that is included in the service advisory letter that you'll receive with these slides. There are several different part numbers for different kits that contain a different number of bushings depending on how in depth your maintenance is going to be. So if you're going to do a complete teardown, you'll get a full kit with every single bushing, including some of the bearings that are in the mechanism, such as the roller bearings and the trip shaft bearing or bushing, as well as all the tough lock bushings. So that'll be detailed in the service advisory letter as to what kits are available and what level of detail they go into in terms of replacing the bushings and bearings for the ML-13. Next question.
That was your last question, Paul.
Well, that was great. I really appreciate everybody attending. Look out for the email with the slides and the service advisory letters that we talked about. And we look forward to meeting again, perhaps at the next webinar.
Thank you everyone for joining. If you need a link to the upcoming webinar, it should be in the Q&A.